Imagine having everything you ever dreamed of, a life of luxury, power, and stability, and suddenly seeing it all crumble before your eyes. The pain of loss is unbearable. But what happens when adversity doesn't break you, but transforms you? This is the story of a woman who, after losing everything she loved most, decided not only to rebuild her dreams, but to surpass them in a way that no one could have predicted. Get ready for a journey of revenge, redemption, and a twist that will challenge everything you think you know about overcoming adversity. When we think of dreams, we often imagine a peaceful, secure future full of achievements. For young Scarlett O'Hara, this was no different. She was born into an upper-class family in the southern United States, in the town of Tara, an estate that represented more than just a piece of land. It was a symbol of status, wealth, and stability. Scarlett was, in everyone's eyes, a woman with a bright future ahead of her. But what she didn't know was that everything she had believed to be solid and unchanging was about to be destroyed in a merciless way. Imagine the life of a young woman who has everything she has ever wanted: a loving family, a luxurious home, a life of parties and events, and an arranged marriage to the man she loved. Everything seemed perfect, and the future seemed mapped out for her. She had all the advantages life could offer: beauty, intelligence, charm, and a privileged position in society. But what really matters in a story like Scarlett's? What happens when everything she believed to be guaranteed begins to fall apart? Scarlett O'Hara was not just an ordinary woman. She had an inner strength that set her apart from everyone else around her. Even in a society where women were seen as mere homemakers, Scarlett believed she could shape her own destiny. Her dream? To create a grand future. To be a woman ahead of her time, with a life of success and influence. She knew that the power of her beauty could guarantee her many privileges, but more importantly, she had ambitions, a fierce desire to achieve something great on her own, something that went beyond the expectations the world had for her. Like any young woman, Scarlett found herself immersed in the romance of youth, in the search for her Prince Charming. But for her, this prince was not only a symbol of affection, but also an anchor for her greater dream. She believed that her love for Ashley Wilkes, the man she had idealized all her life, would be the driving force to achieve everything she desired. She saw a future where her happiness was tied to this love and everything it represented. But as many life stories teach us, fate has a peculiar way of teaching us lessons we never imagined. Scarlett was about to be forced to face a harsh reality. Her dreams and her vision of the future were about to be shaken by an event so devastating that she could never have predicted. What seemed to be the solid foundation of her life would crumble before her eyes. The American Civil War, with its flames and destruction, changed everything. Suddenly, the luxury and stability that Scarlett had known became part of a distant past. The war not only took away her wealth and material security, but also her faith in a predictable and peaceful future. It was not just a financial loss, it was a loss of identity, a loss of everything she thought was important. And at the center of it all was the idea of a love she believed to be eternal, but which would also be destroyed by the same relentless force of war. But what would happen if Scarlett, in the midst of so much destruction, not only survived but found a way to rebuild herself, stronger, more powerful, and with an even greater future than she had imagined? That was her great challenge: not to be consumed by pain and suffering, but to use that pain as fuel for something even greater. This moment of rupture is often the point where true transformation begins. Like many of us, Scarlett had to deal with the impact of losing what she loved most, of seeing her dreams crumble. But the real question is, what would she do after that? Would she give in to despair, allow herself to be consumed by tragedy and pain, or would she use it all to reinvent herself in a way that no one could have predicted? Scarlett O'Hara had to make that choice, and as you will see, her journey of overcoming and victory was not easy, but it was truly inspiring. Now, you may be wondering, how was a woman who seemed to have everything able to rise from the ashes of her own destruction? What made her keep fighting when most people would have given up? How did she manage not only to rebuild her dream, but to surpass it in an even grander way. These answers come with time, and the story of Scarlett O'Hara is a reminder that even in the darkest moments, human strength can be more powerful than any adversity. She teaches us that even when fate seems harsh, the courage and determination to move forward can transform everything. If you're curious to know how Scarlett O'Hara turned her life around and transformed her tragedy into an even greater triumph, keep watching this video. Let's explore this journey of revenge, redemption, and overcoming adversity together. Now, if you're moved or curious about what comes next, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the bell so you don't miss any details of this story of transformation. You can also leave a comment about what you think of this inspiring journey and how you believe overcoming adversity can transform a life. Let's dive into this story together. The sound of bombs echoed in the air, a symphony of destruction that heralded the end of an era. The sky, once clear and serene, was now covered by a thick cloud of smoke, while the heat of war spread like uncontrollable fire. Scarlett O'Hara, until then immersed in her world of luxury and expectations, was about to be thrown into a nightmare that would change everything she knew. What seemed to be a sheltered and carefree life was suddenly invaded by the chaos of the Civil War. Tara, her home, her refuge, began to slowly fall apart. What was once a lush estate, full of life and wealth, was now threatened by imminent destruction. Each explosion seemed to scratch at Scarlett's soul, and even while she was still surrounded by the beauty of her home, she knew that something much bigger and darker was coming. She watched helplessly as her hometown disintegrated. News of the advancing enemy troops spread, and at the same time, she felt a growing weight on her shoulders. Her security, her social status, her fine clothes, her lavish parties, all of it was being swept away by the storm of war. More than that, the war did not just destroy the walls that surrounded her comfortable life. It devastated her own dreams, her future, her certainties. The impact went beyond the physical. When the fires of war reached her city, the fire burned not only the land, but also Scarlett's hopes. Her family's possessions, which she considered her inheritance, disappeared in the flames, and with them, her identity as a wealthy and influential woman was destroyed. She found herself surrounded by uncertainty. A young woman who had once controlled her own destiny now felt powerless in the face of a completely unknown future. But the worst thing was not only the loss of wealth, but the loss of what she most desired, the love of Ashley Wilkes. He, the man she had always imagined to be hers, was swept away by war and the radical change in the world around her. What she believed to be a love story that would never end was cruelly and irreversibly interrupted. And what devastated Scarlett more than any flame-consuming Tara was the loss of her own confidence. She was no longer the charming and powerful woman everyone saw, who believed the world was at her feet. The war had destroyed not only her wealth, but also her confidence in herself and her future. She could no longer afford to be the spoiled daughter who was protected by her social status. She found herself alone, with nothing but memories of a distant past and the harsh reality that lay before her. Suddenly, what had once seemed certain marriage to Ashley, financial stability, life on the Tara plantation, all of it turned into a distant dream, a memory that seemed to be slipping through her fingers like sand between her toes. Every step she took on the path to destruction left a mark on her heart. The moments of pain were endless, but the pain of realizing that everything she had known was disappearing seemed to be the cruelest blow. The war, with its devastating force and devastation, not only took away her wealth and dreams, but also her sense of who she really was. The anguish of seeing her life collapse was not something Scarlett knew how to deal with. She never imagined she would be one of the people who would suffer the loss of everything. What follows such a great fall? How can someone who saw themselves at the top of the world survive when the ground disappears beneath their feet? How can someone so accustomed to control face the loss of everything that gave them security and identity? Young Scarlett O'Hara had to face a brutal truth. The world she believed to be solid and unchanging was crumbling, and there was no one she could turn to restore what was lost. More than any material loss, the feeling of helplessness and loneliness began to erode. The foundation of everything she believed to be her truth. Now, surrounded by the chaos of war, with pain and uncertainty crushing her every step, Scarlett was about to discover that by losing everything, she was not only facing the destruction of her life, but also the birth of a new version of herself, a version that would be forged in the heat of adversity, where revenge and overcoming would become her greatest allies. The pain of loss is something that cannot be predicted. There is no preparation for the emptiness that sets in when the life you knew falls apart before your eyes. Scarlett O'Hara, now facing a world in ruins, had to learn the hard way that pain was not just a passing emotion, but something that could consume her soul if she allowed it. Tara, her home, her land, the place that represented everything she loved and valued, was now marked by the scars of war. The hills, once green and welcoming, were devastated, covered in rubble and ashes. The people she knew, her friends, her ladies-in-waiting, were all fleeing or fighting for survival. What had once seemed to be a solid and respectable society was now unrecognizable. She no longer had luxury, status, or that familiar security. Sadness mingled with frustration and fear, and Scarlett felt the weight of this new reality crushing her every day. Worst of all, however, was the pain of emotional emptiness. She had lost Ashley, the man she believed was her destiny, but she had also lost her confidence in herself and in the world. He had married another woman, and Scarlett was forced to face a cruel fact. The love she believed to be immortal was now a fantasy, a lie constructed by her own desires and illusions. Ashley did not love her the way she wanted him to, and that was a blow much deeper than any material loss. The first days after the collapse of her life were marked by despair. Scarlett didn't know where to look or what to do. She took refuge in her memories of Tara, trying to cling to any fragment of what she thought was her safe and unchanging past. But reality poked at her every moment, like an unbearable, undeep pain, demanding that she accept the tragedy. She felt that deep down, she was sinking, swallowed by a pain that seemed to have no end. But what Scarlett didn't know at the time was that the pain, however intense, could also be the key to her survival. One morning, as she walked through the fields of Tara, the land still scorched and scarred by war, she realized something that would change her outlook forever. She couldn't go on living in constant lament. She couldn't continue sinking into sadness and self-pity. Life was asking her to react, to get up. It was a simple thought, but revolutionary for her. A spark of something inside Scarlett, something strong and indomitable, ignited. She no longer had time to cry over what she had lost. The pain was real, but life, with all its uncertainties, was there, right in front of her. If she wanted to move on, she would have to do something about it. She could no longer wait for someone to rescue her or for things to simply fix themselves. It was her against the world, and she had a choice: succumb to sadness or fight for the chance to rise again. It was at that moment that Scarlett decided she would no longer be a spectator in her own life. She refused to allow herself to sink into misery. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but if she had to survive, she would have to do so with courage, with a new inner strength that she did not yet fully understand. No matter how great the pain was, she couldn't stand still, waiting for things to change on their own. Scarlett then began to adopt a different mindset. She realized she no longer had time to dream of a perfect future, because that perfect future, with Ashley by her side and Tara unbeatable, no longer existed. She needed to somehow create a new vision of herself, one that was stronger, more resilient, more determined. She could no longer hide behind a platonic love or an easy, unchallenging life. She needed to rebuild her world with what was left, even if it was little. The first decision she made was to start working to ensure her survival. She could no longer wait for help to come from others. She would need to stand firm and use her intelligence and resources to rebuild her family and her home. Scarlett knew that the war had taken everything, but she also knew that her inner strength could be what would carry her forward. She had never been a woman to wait passively. She had always had a strong will, And now, more than ever, she needed that strength. That was how the young Scarlett O'Hara, who saw herself defeated by war, loss, and sadness, found her first step toward overcoming. She understood that pain, no matter how deep, could not define who she was. She, more than anyone, knew what she wanted and was willing to fight for it, no matter how difficult it might be. She did not know, at that moment, how exactly everything would work out, but one thing was certain: Scarlett would not be a victim. From now on, she would become the heroine of her own story, the woman who, against all odds, would rise up and rebuild her life, stronger and more determined than ever. That turning point, rejecting sadness and embracing the struggle for survival, marks the beginning of a journey of redemption. Scarlett O'Hara was ready to face whatever came next. She knew the road would be long and arduous, but she had one thing in mind: there was no more room for pain and self-pity. The future was in her hands, and she would take it with courage. If you also believe that we can transform our pain into strength to start over, then be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell to continue following Scarlett's journey. Who knows what else we can learn from her resilience, right? The weight of the world seemed to be on Scarlett O'Hara's shoulders. With each passing day, the scars of war deepened. Tara, her home, was now in ruins. The land that was once fertile and prosperous was now a devastated field, marked by destruction and pain. But more than the scorched earth and surrounding rubble, it was Scarlett's spirit that seemed to be on the verge of a definitive collapse. The young woman who had once been the embodiment of confidence and ambition now found herself lost, at the mercy of the cruel fate that war had imposed on her. She, who had always had everything she wanted, now faced a relentless reality. Luxury and security had disappeared, and with them, the comfortable life she knew. The loss of Ashley, the love of her life, from which she never fully recovered, only added to the pain of the situation. But there was something inside Scarlett that still refused to accept that her story would end there. She didn't know exactly what she would do, or how she would do it, but one thing was clear to her: she would not be a victim. There was a growing resistance in her chest, a fury she did not yet fully understand, but which propelled her forward, always in search of something more. Regret and self-pity were no longer options for Scarlett. She realized that as long as she wallowed in the pain of loss, the world around her would continue to turn, indifferent to her suffering. What really mattered? The pain or the strength to overcome it? The turning point came when Scarlett saw her family, her home, her land, sink into a sea of difficulties. She knew she couldn't wait for things to get better on their own, for help to come from somewhere, or for fate to change her luck. She needed to act. There was no more time to wait or cry. It was time to make a radical decision, to fight for her survival, to fight to rebuild her life, to fight for the chance to regain control of her destiny. In a moment of clarity, Scarlett looked out over the fields of Tara, the land that had been her family's for generations, and made a promise to herself: she would not let that legacy be destroyed without a fight. She looked at the rubble around her and realized that instead of bowing down to destruction, she could rise up. But that would require courage, determination, and, above all, a willingness to do whatever it took. She was no longer a woman who could rely on her family's wealth or society's standards. Scarlett had to learn to be resilient, to look to the future with the same willpower that had guided her in her youth before the war destroyed everything she knew. The decision not to be a victim, to reject the idea that life had imposed an irremediable fate on her, was the greatest choice Scarlett could have made. She realized that even without all the answers, she could fight. She didn't know how to rebuild everything she had lost, but she knew that if she could find a way to survive, it would put her on a path to power. She had been a princess in a fairy tale, but now she would become the heroine of her own story. Over the next few days, Scarlett immersed herself in her work. Every action, every small task she performed, took her away from the bitterness of defeat and brought her closer to her true mission: to rebuild her life, her family, her land. She looked for ways to bring money into her home, And without hesitation, she was able to form alliances with people she never imagined she could count on. She made sacrifices that many would not be willing to make, dealing with the harshness of everyday life and the constant struggle for survival. What seemed to be a simple impulse to survive quickly turned into an unshakable determination. Scarlett began to see the struggle for survival not as a temporary condition, but as the foundation for something bigger, something greater. She was no longer just trying to survive, but laying the groundwork for something that no one could take away from her. She no longer saw herself as a victim of circumstances, but as a woman in search of her own path, with an inner strength capable of transforming pain into fuel for her achievements. Scarlett was confronted with many situations that required courage. She had to negotiate with difficult people, fight for land, and deal with scarce resources. Each step she took brought her closer to the woman she would become. There was no room for weakness in her new world. She was determined to build, to move forward, to regain everything she had lost, and much more. This decision, this change of mindset, was what gave Scarlett the strength she needed to move forward. Not being a victim did not mean denying the pain. On the contrary, she had to face it head-on, recognizing that loss was part of her journey. But not allowing that pain to consume her was what truly transformed Scarlett. She did not give in to sadness, anger, or regret. Instead, she chose to transform everything she had suffered into motivation to be more, do more, and achieve what many thought was impossible. That decision not to be a victim was the moment that changed everything for Scarlett O'Hara. From that point on, she would not only face life's challenges, but take them as an opportunity to grow, to surpass herself, to reinvent herself. She would no longer be a woman at the mercy of circumstances, but a woman in control of her destiny. This transformation did not happen overnight, but each step Scarlett took toward her new life was a victory over her own pain, a victory over the idea that she was powerless in the face of fate. She knew the road would be long and arduous, but more importantly, she knew that the fight had already begun. And contrary to what the war had shown her, she had something much more powerful in her hands, the unbreakable will to fight for her life, her future, and her success. If you also believe that no one can take away your control over your destiny, that overcoming adversity is a choice, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Don't miss the continuation of Scarlett's inspiring journey. Let's explore together how she gets back up and takes control of her life. After making the decision not to be a victim, Scarlett O'Hara knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The war had devastated not only her home and possessions, but also her identity and the structure of the society in which she lived. Everything she knew was in ruins, and yet Scarlett did not allow herself to give in to the fear of uncertainty. She was determined to rebuild her life, her family, and the legacy of Tara. But what she didn't realize was that the real battle would not only be against external forces but against everything she carried within herself. The early days of rebuilding were relentless. The need to survive forced Scarlett to deal with a reality completely different from the one she knew. She no longer depended on her family's wealth or the protection of the social status she had before. She would have to fight for every piece of land, every scarce resource, and even the respect of those who once saw her as a delicate young woman whose life was guaranteed by her position. Society, which once admired her for her beauty and charm, now viewed her with suspicion. Scarlett, an upper-class woman without her jewelry and expensive dresses, was now in the midst of a world that had been transformed, a world where the rules had changed and where women were forced to adapt or disappear. Deep down, Scarlett knew that society was not willing to easily accept her into its new reality. She needed to prove herself, not only to others, but to herself. Every step she took toward rebuilding her life seemed to collide with a new barrier. The men she negotiated with were more interested in immediate profit than in rebuilding her future. She faced a market where men had a monopoly on opportunities, where women were seen as secondary figures, without a voice or power. Scarlett no longer had a father who could intercede for her, nor the protection of her mother who had taught her the traditional ways of being a lady. She had to find her own voice, and that meant challenging everything society expected of her. In addition, Scarlett had to deal with the internal emotional obstacles that arose with the pressure of her new reality. The pain of Ashley's loss still weighed heavily on her heart, and the longing for a lost love consumed her in moments of silence. She found herself constantly torn between the desire to fight for him against the logic that said he would never be hers, and the recognition that she needed to move on. This internal conflict, this unresolved pain, was a constant shadow that hung over her steps. But contrary to what she expected, Scarlett discovered that it would not be possible to build something solid while she was still stuck in a past that would never return. And that forced her to face her own vulnerability, something she never imagined she would have to do. During long nights, she asked herself, can I really be more than the daughter of a wealthy landowner? Can I overcome the pain of losing what I loved most? These questions had no easy answers, but Scarlett O'Hara, the woman who did not want to be a victim, refused to give in to uncertainty. In practical terms, what seemed like a simple task of rebuilding soon turned into an even greater challenge. Crops were scarce, the land was difficult to work, and the lack of labor made everything more complicated. She had to negotiate with suppliers, deal with the lack of resources, and find creative ways to get back on her feet. It was a constant battle against the relentless winds of adversity, and Scarlett was not afraid to get her hands dirty, to get directly involved in the hard work. With every step she took, every grain of soil she conquered, she knew she was building something new, something of her own. But perhaps the greatest challenge of all was learning to balance her ambition with the feelings of loneliness that consumed her. The weight of being a woman trying to reinvent herself in a world that was not yet ready to accept her for who she really was immense. She found herself forced to abandon the false expectations she had about love and the people around her. Deep down, Scarlett knew that in order to achieve success, she would have to leave behind her illusions about what she wanted the world to be and accept the world as it really was: hard, cold, ruthless, but also full of possibilities for those willing to fight. She also faced constant internal doubt. Was she doing all this for herself or just to try to prove something to others? There were moments when the loneliness became unbearable, and Scarlett wondered if it was all worth it. But it was in that moment of doubt that she realized something crucial. Success would not come from the acceptance of others or from a life of ease. She needed to fight, not to please others, but to be able to look at herself and say, I won. I was stronger than everything they tried to make me believe. Scarlett O'Hara's journey to rebuild her life and career was not a straight line. It was a constant battle against conformity, against the limits that society tried to impose on her, and against the pain of a broken heart. But the strength she found along the way did not come from a desire for revenge or a simple desire to prove something to those who looked down on her. Her true strength came from recognizing her own ability to fight, from understanding that, no matter how much life had knocked her down, she was the only person capable of getting up and moving forward. Every difficulty, every challenge she faced was an opportunity to learn, to adapt, and eventually to triumph. What seemed to be an obstacle often became the cornerstone of her new life: stronger, more resilient, more determined. Scarlett was no longer the young, dreamy, and naive girl. She was now a woman shaped by adversity, forged by the heat of battle, and with a clearer vision of what it took to achieve her goals. And as lonely as the road was, Scarlett already knew what awaited her: a life of achievements, perhaps solitary, but without regrets. She was determined to create something great, not only for herself, but for all those who doubted her strength. True power did not come from possessions, status, or the expectations of others. It came from the ability to get back up, to fight, to reinvent herself with every step. And in the end, Scarlett O'Hara would realize that every challenge she faced was not just about rebuilding her life, but about creating a new legacy, something that no one else could take away from her. Pain, as Scarlett soon learned, was not just a passing feeling, but an indomitable force that could consume her soul if she did not know how to use it. For months, She had tried to ignore the emptiness that Ashley's abandonment had left in her heart. She had tried to fill that void with work, with effort, with relentless attempts to rebuild Tara. But the truth was that the pain of loss was not something that could simply be ignored or swept under the rug. She knew that in order to move forward, she would have to find a way to make the pain work for her, not against her. She couldn't continue to be a prisoner of her emotions. She couldn't continue to grieve over what she had lost. The pain, with time, could be molded into something powerful, something that would propel her further than she had ever imagined. It was in a moment of solitude, during a quiet night in Tara, that Scarlett had the epiphany that would change her life. She found herself lying in her bed, her heart heavy, thinking about everything the war had taken from her: her family, her love, her comfort, and her security. But deep down, she knew she could no longer allow herself to mourn the things she had lost. Lamenting would not bring Ashley back, and despair would not restore Tara to its former glory. She had no more room for suffering. It was time to transform that pain into something that would propel her forward. And it was at that moment that Scarlett made a crucial decision. She would no longer allow pain to define her. She would use it as fuel to become stronger, more resilient, and above all, bolder than she had ever been. She didn't just want to survive, she wanted to thrive, to conquer, to be the woman who would exceed all expectations. Every painful thought about Ashley, every bitter memory of her destroyed homeland, she decided to transform into an unstoppable force that would push her forward. No longer feeling powerless in the face of loss, Scarlett began to realize that her pain, however intense, was a powerful ally. She knew that her love for Ashley would never fade, but over time, what seemed to be her greatest weakness turned into immense motivation. She was determined to be more than someone defined by unrequited love. Instead of sinking into self-pity, Scarlett chose to use the pain of loss as the engine that drove her actions. She became more involved in the daily challenges of rebuilding Tara. Every difficulty she faced, every obstacle that seemed insurmountable, she saw as an opportunity to grow stronger. Instead of retreating, she moved forward with the certainty that the pain she felt made her more capable of enduring hardship. She began to make bolder decisions, to take more risks. So it was that, realizing that the market was in crisis and that the land needed more than just basic care, Scarlett found the courage to negotiate with people she would never have imagined confronting before. She sought out new allies, without hesitating to form alliances with those who held economic power in the region. She knew that without these partnerships, there would be no way to save the farm, and it was with rare boldness that she began to reformulate her approach. She no longer had time to worry about looks of distrust or judgment. She needed action. As the weeks passed, Scarlett realized that as she used pain as fuel, what had once seemed like an unbearable burden became a guide, a force that made her unbeatable. Her fears, her insecurities, and her sadness were gradually transformed into a fierce determination not to fail. She knew that by challenging the pain, she was becoming something stronger and more capable of achieving her goals than she had ever imagined. She no longer wanted to be remembered as the woman who lost everything, but as the woman who rebuilt everything from destruction. At that time, Scarlett learned the true meaning of inner strength. It wasn't just about resisting or surviving. It was about being able to pick up the broken pieces of herself and use them to build something even greater. Every tear shed for Ashley, every moment of despair, and every dawn when she wondered how she could go on, now became the cornerstones of something great. She would no longer wait for the world to fix her life. She would take control of her destiny and make her own luck. Scarlett's transformation was not instantaneous, nor was it without sacrifice. But what the pain gave her was a clear vision. Rebuilding her life did not depend on regaining the past, but on creating a new future. She was determined to prove to herself and the world that even in the most desolate circumstances, it was possible to rise up and make the impossible happen. Scarlett no longer looked to the past with regret, but with a new purpose. She now understood that the pain of loss had been the furnace where her new identity was being forged. She was no longer a woman defined by a lost love or a life of wealth and luxury. She was a woman who knew what it meant to fight for her own survival, for her own identity, and for the chance to create something even greater than what she had lost. And so, each step she took on the path to rebuilding her life became firmer, bolder, more determined. Scarlett was not only overcoming her pain, she was transcending it, using it as the driving force that would lead her to her greatest victory. The world, which once seemed insurmountable, now lay before her, and she knew that nothing, not even pain, could stop her from achieving what she had imagined for her future. This was the reborn Scarlett O'Hara, a woman who used her pain not as an anchor, but as the flame that lit her inner fire, a woman ready to conquer whatever was necessary to achieve greatness. And as she looked to the future, she knew that the best was yet to come. As Scarlett O'Hara moved forward with rebuilding her life and the daily challenges that lay ahead, a silent conflict grew within her. Despite her newfound determination and strength, there was something else she couldn't get out of her mind: her thirst for revenge. The war had not only destroyed her home and her dreams, but it had also deprived her of the love of Ashley, the man she believed was her destiny. To complicate matters further, there was the betrayal she felt when he married Melanie, her friend and silent rival. All of this made her wonder, why should she move forward with dignity when the world seemed to have been so cruel? The desire for revenge was beginning to creep into Scarlett's thoughts. She wanted to make those responsible for her pain pay for what they had done. She wanted those who saw her as nothing more than a fragile woman, destined only to be a wife and mother, to see what she was capable of when pushed to her limits. The men who treated her with contempt, the people who doubted her, Scarlett felt a growing need to show everyone that she was not someone to be underestimated. Revenge presented itself as a tempting way out. She imagined herself back at the old Tara, with everything she had lost, and making all those who had ignored or belittled her see her success. The thought that Ashley would realize her worth and regret not choosing her took hold of her in moments of anger. It wasn't just personal revenge. It was revenge for what life had taken from her, for the pain, the losses, and the isolation. This anger consumed her in moments of weakness, when she still felt vulnerable to what she had lost. But on the other hand, there was another voice, softer, but still firm, whispering inside her mind. What if revenge isn't the answer? What if, instead of being consumed by anger, she used all that pain to redeem herself and grow from it? What if, instead of waiting for others to pay for their mistakes, she took complete control of her own destiny and turned her tragedies into forces that would create something greater? That voice insisted on reminding her that her true strength lay not in destroying those who had hurt her, but in proving that she could be more, that she could be someone who didn't need anyone else to validate her greatness. The desire for redemption was more difficult to accept, as it involved a more complex internal transformation. It was easier to lose herself in anger, easier to seek revenge and feel that justice had been done. But Scarlett knew that true transformation would come from overcoming from the moment she chose to move on and build a life greater and richer than the one she had lost, without having to demean others. Scarlett's dilemma between revenge and redemption was not just a moral battle. It was a battle for her soul. She knew that if she succumbed to revenge, it would mean that she would remain a prisoner of the past. The anger she felt might even be the force that fueled her, but she would not allow it to define who she was. She feared that if she let revenge take over her life, it would cause her to lose the most important things she had achieved: her inner strength, her autonomy, and perhaps most importantly, her ability to move forward without carrying the weight of old resentments. But why should she forgive those who had caused her so much suffering? Why not make them feel some of the pain she felt? These questions swirled around in Scarlett's mind with every decision she made. She thought of Ashley and Melanie, and how betrayed she felt by each of them, each in a different way, but still with the same devastating effect. Then, in one of those moments of reflection, when Scarlett looked out over the fields of Tara and saw the horizon, she made a choice. She realized she couldn't go on living with the ghosts of the past. Revenge would not bring back what she had lost. On the contrary, it would keep her trapped in an endless cycle of anger and despair. No, she wanted something more. She wanted peace. She wanted the freedom to live without the constant shadow of grief. Instead of letting herself be consumed by revenge, Scarlett decided to focus on her personal growth. She knew that to be truly great, she needed to find her own value, not based on destroying others, but on building herself in a new mold. Redemption did not mean forgiving others immediately. It was, rather, a choice to look at herself and see that, no matter how hurt she was, she had the power to rebuild herself. And that was what she would do. Scarlett's choice was not easy. The anger and resentment were still there, but she knew that in order to move forward, she would need to channel her emotions in a more productive way. She could not let the mistakes of others, the betrayals and losses, define her. The power was in her hands, and she had decided to use that power to create a better, stronger, and greater future. This was the moment when Scarlett O'Hara finally chose her own redemption. She understood that by letting go of her desire for revenge, she was not becoming weak, she was becoming stronger than she had ever imagined. True victory would not come from making others pay, but from proving to herself that she was capable of more. She was no longer a woman defined by the pain of the past, but a woman determined to create a future of success, strength, and greatness. The battle between revenge and redemption was over, and Scarlett, with her head held high, chose redemption. And so, Scarlett O'Hara's path to becoming the woman she had always dreamed of being was finally set. The wind blew strongly over the hills of Tara, carrying with it the promise of a new era. Scarlett O'Hara, stronger, wiser, and relentlessly determined, was about to experience the culmination of her journey, not just the rebuilding of her life, but the overcoming of everything she had imagined to be her limit. What had seemed impossible was now a reality within her grasp. She had not only restored what she had lost, her home, her land, her material possessions, but she had achieved something far more valuable. She had rebuilt herself. Scarlett was no longer the young dreamer who dragged herself through pain, nor the woman poisoned by anger and revenge. She had become a woman of power, vision, and above all, unbreakable courage. The pain that once crushed her was now her ally. She used her experience, her mistakes, her wounds, to create something even greater than anyone could have imagined. And in the end, it was overcoming her own fear and doubt that led her to an even more significant triumph. Scarlett proved that when life challenges us, there are no limits to what we can achieve if we are willing to fight, grow, and learn from our falls. Every step of her journey, every battle she faced, every moment of pain or doubt, strengthened her for something greater, the realization of her own potential. She had finally surpassed expectations, the limitations imposed by society, and even her own. The greatest thing of all was that Scarlett was no longer fighting for a future she had already lost, but for a future she had created herself. The empire she had rebuilt was no longer just about Tara, it was about her, about the power she had found within herself. She no longer needed anyone's approval to feel whole. She knew, finally, that her greatest achievement was her own transformation. Scarlett O'Hara's life was not just about rebuilding what she had lost, but about achieving something deeper and more lasting, the ability to reinvent herself and rise above all adversity. She taught us that true greatness is not defined by what we possess, but by the strength with which we face our downfalls, by the determination to never give up, and by the courage to believe that, even in chaos, we can create something greater than we ever imagined. And so, the great turnaround happened. Scarlett O'Hara became not only the woman who restored her life, but the woman who, with her own hands and heart, built a new legacy. She didn't just survive the storm, she turned it into her greatest triumph. If you were moved by Scarlett's journey and believe that you too can achieve something great, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories of overcoming adversity and triumph. Let's embark on this journey of inspiration and transformation together.